Welcome to this Energy Quick Chat, where we rub minds with stakeholders in the energy market. I am Justina Okechukwu. Today we are joined by Joseph Ochieno, political analyst and international journalist based in Uganda. Thank you for joining me on Energy Frontiers today, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Now, speak to me. What does the withdrawal by global financiers from Uganda's oil and gas projects mean for the country?
I think the Ugandan oil sector has had ups and downs, but I think we are coming closer to the reality of the real thing. The biggest challenge, of course, has been financing. We have had various parties and partners coming in to participate in the project, but much more recently, of course, part of the setback has been the bad press that Uganda got and the withdrawal of key funders. At the moment, the government said recently that they are rather confident that they will be able to mobilize and organize resources. I think interested parties have now come, including China, and so it would appear that for the moment the project is on. It's been so long that now most Ugandans and indeed most other observers across the continent, across the globe, can only wait and see come the reality of the time. But the assurance is that, yes, we are on track.
Yeah, recently the Petroleum Authority said they were trying to mobilize funding. How does the administration of President Museveni plan to mobilize financing from other sources from its hydrocarbon project?
It's going to be difficult. It's going to be tricky. He sounds very, very confident about it, but I think it's because of oil, because it's oil, so many people will be interested. As I hinted to you, a number of interested parties will be wanting to participate. Even if the major players, particularly from the West, are now playing shy. I think while the president has talked about mobilization, perhaps a possibility of generating resources domestically, the country has a huge debt burden and at the moment literally struggling with being able to sustain some of its own basic domestic requirements, as basic as recently. It has been reported that the government could not support the process of local council elections, the law structures in the country. But that said, they are arguing that perhaps they're going to begin being much more prudent in terms of mobilization of domestic taxation, maybe rejiggling some of their budgetary provisions. How much is not very clear. But I think the commitment from their point of perspective is that perhaps anything else can wait, but the oil has to flow.
Now, while that is on, I can't but wonder, is it possible to mobilize domestic capital for this project, allowing Ugandans to own their own project?
I think it's really unfortunate that thus far African countries and African governments have not learned from the Norways of this world when it comes to basically mobilization of domestic resources, capitalization of many of their own projects. Recently, there have been conversations about possibility of trying to find a way in which we're able to reclaim our former indigenous Uganda Commercial Bank and many other related financial institutions that would actually help in this way. At this material time, beyond the ordinary usual bonds and treasury bonds and treasury bills, I'm not quite sure, considering Uganda's own market, I'm not quite sure how much we can claim that we're able to mobilize sufficiently domestically. I think for the moment, and considering the stage in which we are on this, very likely we are still going to be dependent. It is quite sad that for oil in Uganda, if you look, the big owners in percentage terms on this project are Total and Etal, the usual suspects from the West. And then you find Ugandan government having very small share of these monies. So for the moment, anyway, I think the government is simply saying that, well, whatever happens, whatever percentage they get, they will get. But at the end of the day, I think the biggest share of the net proceeds is going to go to external finances. And as I said, Uganda will benefit, but I'm not quite sure whether we are still independent enough in terms of our fiscal policies and programs enough to be able to guarantee a possibility of a net independence, if you like, as far as supporting this project is concerned.
Now, what is the plan of the Ugandan government to utilize the oil revenues and avoid the so-called oil costs?
I think that's a very difficult question. Nobody can tell, considering that the Ugandan authorities, the Ugandan government is one that has been in power for the last 40 years and one that came to power without the mandate of the people. And one of the most common things in Uganda is conversations about elections and mandates and election rigging, even if it's local elections. Then you know very well that if that is the background, then it's very unlikely that you're dealing with a regime that is mandated, a regime that is conscious of the basic needs of the people, a regime that is conscious of demands from the public. So that is a very blunt answer I can give you as far as this is concerned. But that said, does not mean that dictatorships don't develop. Gaddafi managed to utilize the oil revenues in Libya for the Libyans. A number of other dictatorships have done so and made sure that the economies have grown. In Uganda's case, I think, if the authorities are not possibly willing or such authorities that are not tuned to decent use of the natural resources, you expect to have an active, organized citizenry to demand for that. Basically, a political activism or indeed civil society. In Uganda at the moment, both are still rather weak. That said, though, I think there is an increasing awareness generally that this oil thing has been coming in for a long time. I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on the Ugandan authorities to ensure that there is public accountability for most of the resources and to ensure that these resources are spent generally well. The oil cost on Africa, as for me, someone who's been an activist and someone who's been commenting and writing and actually following Africa for the last 20 or so years, I did not know that we would be talking about this kind of a topic where the issue in doubt is how we spend our oil dollars. Unfortunately, this is the reality. Just my hope that the Ugandan authorities will, hopefully, particularly because of the political pressure they now have, with less and less resources coming, particularly from their Western allies, who basically babied them predominantly in the late 90s, in the 90s and the early 2000s, that it will be now an imperative for them to begin to utilize our oil dollars and to ensure that the oil dollars go to the very obvious and key sectors in terms of education, health, infrastructure, and hopefully then protection of our environment while growing for the future.
Now, in terms of energy access, I know Uganda has been delving into some of these things. How are they harnessing their potential for other energy sources?
I'm not sure whether Uganda is doing as well as it should, and I don't know any other African countries. I think I'm generally very critical about the continent. Perhaps I put my other hat when an African writer and scholar are following many of these campaigns around not only the environment, but harnessing our natural resources for ourselves. There's no reason why we should not be using solar more. There is no reason why we should not be using alternative energy more. I told you, and I think I said at the beginning of this conversation, that Ugandan capital is the most polluted African capital. And that means, therefore, that environmentally we're not doing particularly well. There is a substantial element of unplanning. While there is a huge demand for energy alternatives in capital cities, rural Africa still continues to be very minimally accessed for things as basic as electricity. And I hope that with the generation of oil, as I say, that hopefully the situation will change and that there will be much more awareness, not in terms of how best we utilize our resources, but how we begin to look at alternative energy. Earlier, I was just reading the impressive way in which in the European Union, they've got these trucks, they call the hydrogen trucks, which are going to be pulling and pushing goods across Italy and the rest of Europe and to ensure that they meet their commitments for carbon emission. These are not conversations which are big on the African continent. I can tell you that it's not a big conversation in Uganda. You can possibly sense that some of us use every opportunity on the media to talk about these things because, unfortunately, climate change and its own challenges matters which are hardly heard on this continent, almost as if climate change deniers like Donald Trump.
That was an interesting and eye-opening conversation right there. Thank you so much for speaking with us on Energy Frontiers. Joseph Ochieno, political economist and international journalist based in Uganda. That's it on our Energy Quick Chat, and I thank you everyone for watching. I am Justina Okechukwu. I'll see you next time.